All right, we'll just wait another minute or two to let everyone else join who is not with us yet, and then we'll get started. Are there any questions while we wait from anybody? All right. Well, if you have a question, just go ahead and ask. Yeah, we'll just wait another minute or two here. All right. We'll go ahead and get started, and hopefully those that aren't with us yet will join soon. All right. So before we get started with the new material here, the second half of this chapter 4, are there any questions from last time about anything? No? Okay, cool. All right. So this is where we left off. Thinking about, we were thinking about consumer surplus, right, and choice of care, right, measuring the value, um, maximizing surplus, those sorts of things, right? So looking at the demand curve as a marginal value curve, right, using it to sort of think about willingness to pay and the value to a consumer, right? So just to refresh your memory on where we left off there. Today, we're mostly talking about the effect of insurance on demand, right? Because so far, we've been ignoring insurance completely. We've been just thinking about um, really the only thing that determines demand is utility and the budget constraint. So um, completely ignoring insurance, but obviously insurance plays a really, really important role in the provision of medical care. So obviously, we need to think about this as well. Um, so the main thing is that for the most part, I don't know if there's any counterexamples to this, but health insurance lowers the effective price of medical care, right? It reduces the amount that people have to pay for it, the consumers have to pay for it, right? So um,
And you know, the point of insurance, all types of insurance, not just medical insurance, but you know, car insurance, life insurance, right? Is the point is to reduce financial risk. Um, and in the case of medical care, it does this by lowering the cost of medical care. And you know, of course, we all know the law of demand. And if the cost or the price is reduced, what happens to quantity demanded? Well, it goes up, right? So people use more medical care when they have insurance than when they don't. Um, so, like, I mean, that's in a nutshell, like what's going on, right? But obviously, there's like fine details that we want to think about and learn about. So, um, there are kind of some typical and important features of health insurance. So, one of those is co-payments. And this is simply the fact that, I mean, you can kind of think of it like cost sharing, right? So um, typically, health insurance doesn't cover everything, right? Typically, the consumer has to chip in a little bit and share the costs of the medical care with the insurer. So those are called co-payments. Um, and kind of related, actually, are deductibles, but they operate slightly differently. So it's still deductibles are still a form of cost sharing, but they operate a little bit differently. So we'll talk about deductibles. And then there's also very frequently sort of these upper limits or caps or ceilings on coverage, right? So a lot of insurance policies will have a cap. So like they won't pay anything beyond, say, $100,000 per year. Okay, so if you hit that cap and you go beyond it, you're essentially no longer insured once you surpass that upper limit. Um, and sometimes there's like supplemental insurance that can sometimes like alleviate that situation, but for the most part, like typically people don't ever hit these caps. It's only in like really 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 bad situations that people hit these caps, in which case, you know, there's, I don't know, hopefully that never happens to any of us, but something to think about. All right, so first we're going to talk about co-payments and the different types of co-payments that can exist. So, like I said, it's basically a way for the consumer to share in the cost of care, so that the insurance company isn't paying the entire bill, right? They're paying like a fraction or something like that, right? So there are some like traditional forms of co-payments. There is what's called proportional co-insurance rates, which is basically the consumer pays a specified fraction, so like 20% or 25%, something like that. So that's co-insurance rates. There's something that's less common, called flat indemnity payments, and this is basically just where the insurance company pays a flat fee for every single procedure or treatment. So it would be like, you know, if you go to your primary care physician, the insurance company gives you 100. If you go to a specialist, they give you $100, right? It doesn't matter what it is. They just gave you this. They give you the same flat payment every single time, and those are less common than co-insurance rates, but they do exist. And then the other one is a fixed dollar consumer copay, which is actually becoming more common. So this example would be, you pay $20 for an office visit, or you pay $40 for an ER visit, right? It's just a flat fee. Um, so those are like I said, those are becoming more and more common. Um, and and so the third one, right, the fixed dollar consumer copay is perhaps the most easy to analyze with regard to demand, right? It's just a flat copayment, typically like on a per visit or per exam basis, and it's ultimately the effective price for the consumer. And like I said, this is very common these days in modern health plans, and it's probably the easiest. to analyze, we simply find where the copay intersects the demand curve, right? If the copay is the effective price for the consumer, then we just go from that copay price over to the demand curve, and that's the amount of medical care that the consumer will consume. So that's straightforward. That one's easy. All right, and I think one of the main reasons these are becoming more popular is because of their ease of administration. It's very easy to administrate. You just keep track of the visits and multiply that number of visits by the copay, and you've got, you know, what you need to collect from the consumer, right? So very easy to keep track of and record. So that's probably one reason for their popularity. But there are some issues in terms of the incentives that are created from this sort of co-payment, right? There's no incentive for the consumer to try to shop for lower prices, right? And in fact, they may even shop for higher prices if higher prices mean better quality, right? Um, and so that's kind of a perverse incentive, right? Something that is going to lead to inefficiencies. Um, Now, this isn't as big of an issue for what are called managed care plans. So these are like, if you've ever heard of HMOs, that's an example of a managed care plan. So with HMOs, the insurance company actually does the shopping. So they purposefully look for cost-effective doctors, and they also negotiate prices. So this isn't as big of a deal with those types of plans. And we're going to look at those plans in detail when we get to the chapters on insurance. Um, so that's actually beneficial, right? So maybe managed care plans are a more efficient means of providing insurance, and we'll actually talk about that pretty extensively. I think it's in chapter 11, 10 or 11. Another issue is that sometimes these types of plans don't make any sort of distinction between physicians, right? So they just say it's $20 to go see a doctor, whether it's a primary care physician or a radiologist, right? Some kind of specialist. And what this does, the effect of this is that it basically makes the specialists relatively cheaper, right? So, for example, you might have a $20 copay, and maybe the primary care physician is $80 a visit, and the specialist is $120 a visit, right? Well, in that case, the consumer is paying 25% of the cost of the primary care physician, but they're only paying 16, almost 17% of the specialist visit, right? So in that sense, it's a relatively cheaper to see the physician, even though the co-payment is the same, right? But you're getting, presumably with the specialist, you're getting a higher level of care, whether it's in terms of quality or extensive margin or even intensive margin, right? You're getting more for your money with the specialist in most cases. Um, but also, in a lot of cases, you don't typically know that you need to go to a specialist until you go to a primary care physician. So keep that in mind too. Um, all right. So while this consumer copay flat fee type of scenario is relatively easy to analyze, it does create some potentially bad incentives, right? That's kind of the key takeaway here with those, except for in the case of managed care plans that might be able to get around some of those problems. Um, all right, so let's move on to a little bit more complicated one to analyze. This was the first one in our list, the co-insurance rate type of copayment. So this is where the consumer pays a fraction or a percentage of the medical bill. So say 20% or 30% or something like that, right? Um, so if we called the co-insurance rate C, then the insurance company would pay 1 minus C in terms of the fraction, right? So if C was 0.25, right, 25%, that means the insurance company pays 75%, right? Pretty straightforward. Nothing surprising there. But the effect on the demand curve is not exactly straightforward. It's not exactly what you might think. Okay, but we're going to look at this, what the effect is in figure 4.9 here. Okay, so what we have here is two demand curves. We have the demand curve where there is no insurance, right? So the demand curve that we learned to derive in the first half of the chapter, right? Ignoring insurance. The other demand curve is the demand curve with coinsurance rate C. Okay, so as you can see, essentially what the effect is for the demand curve to rotate clockwise around the x-axis, or the x-intercept rather, right? So you'll notice that the intercept is the same at point E, and the effect of coinsurance is to kind of rotate the demand curve. And so the way that you can think about this is, let's start off by looking at let's look at PM1, right? The price for the amount of medical care M1. So obviously, without insurance, the quantity demanded would be M1, right? Now let's assume that the patient has a coinsurance rate of C. Well, instead of paying PM1, they're going to pay C times PM1, right? Because they're only paying a fraction of the price. And so if we look down at the lowest dashed line down at the bottom there, you see that C times PM1. Okay, so that's the effective price for this consumer, for this patient. And so what we want to do is we want to trace from that price over to the insurance, over to the demand curve with no insurance. And that will tell us the amount of medical care demanded at the price C PM1. And so what we see is that that would actually lead to a level of medical care M2, right? So without insurance, it would be M1. With this coinsurance rate, it would be M2. So we can take that quantity and go up to the demand curve with coinsurance to point B, essentially, right? So when the price is PM1, the consumer demands a level or quantity M2. Does everybody see that? Okay. And so that's essentially why the demand curve is rotating clockwise with insurance, with this coinsurance rate, is because at all prices, the consumer is going to consume a higher level of medical care, right? A higher quantity. And basically, the closer that C gets to zero, the more it rotates. And in fact, if C was zero, it would be perfectly vertical at E, at that point E there on the intercept, right? Because if you look at the demand curve without insurance, point E is the amount of medical care consumed if price is zero, right? And a coinsurance rate of zero basically means that the price is zero, right? Care is free. There's no payment. So the consumer would consume exactly the amount as if the price was zero, right? So that's kind of what's going on here with the demand curve. Just this rotation clockwise, and then the extreme is a vertical demand curve when the coinsurance rate is zero, right? So basically, depending on the coinsurance rate, the actual demand curve is going to fall somewhere between the demand curve with no insurance and the straight up and down vertical demand at point E. So it'll fall somewhere between those, depending on the coinsurance rate. And like I said, the closer the coinsurance rate gets to zero, the lower it gets, right? The smaller percentage that the consumer has to pay, the more it rotates, and then zero copayment or zero coinsurance rate is the extreme. All right. Are there any questions about this this chart, this graph, and how that works? Okay. So you could do something similar with price M2, right? PM2, basically the same thing, right? In this case, this consumer would be paying an effective price of C times PM2 you find where that intersects the original demand curve, and then that's the quantity that the consumer would consume at PM2, which is point D on the steeper demand curve. Okay. All right. So basically, what we saw is that this results in the demand curve rotating clockwise. The lower C is, the more it rotates. And if C equals 0, then the demand curve is a vertical line at the x-intercept of the original demand curve. So those are the major results. But then also, and hopefully you thought about this when you saw that demand curve getting steeper, is that it makes demand less elastic. And in fact, if we get to a coinsurance rate of 0, then the elasticity becomes 0, right? There's no response to price changes because the consumer doesn't pay anything, right? But that's basically what's happening, right? As the consumer pays a lower and lower percentage of the bill, they become less responsive to price, and hopefully that's intuitive, right? I'm not going to care much about price changes if I don't pay that much as a fraction of the cost, right? So hopefully there's some intuition for you there. Okay. Now it's important to note something here because right before we started this discussion about insurance, we were talking about consumer surplus, right? So it's important to note here that while there's two important aspects of behavior that's being illustrated here, we should not treat these new demand curves as marginal value curves for the purpose of calculating surplus, right? Um, Insurance is not changing the value of medical care to the consumer. It's changing the cost, right? So that's what we were looking at. The rotation was illustrating how the change in the cost to the consumer leads to a change in the amount of medical care consumed. But it does not fundamentally, it doesn't increase the value of the medical care to the consumer, right? So, so what we really need to think about if we care about consumer surplus is we need to use that demand curve without insurance, right? The original demand curve. That's the one we would use to calculate surplus. Okay. And we would use, we wouldn't use PM1 and PM2 as the prices. We would use CPM1 and CPM2, right? The effective prices. So using the original demand curve, and maybe I'll go back real quick here to that picture, try to point this out specifically here. Where's my laser pointer? Bring that out. Okay, so if we're interested in calculating surplus, consumer surplus, we're going to use the original demand curve here. And so, for example, if the price was PM1, well, then the consumer only pays C times PM1 and consumes M2 in terms of quantity. And so the consumer surplus would be this area below the demand curve, but above CPM1, right? So this area up in here. So that would be consumer surplus. It would not be, something over up in here, right? We can't use this new demand curve to calculate surplus, right? Again, because it's not reflecting marginal values, right? It's illustrating the responsiveness to price changes that the consumer faces, right? But the value of the medical care is illustrated by the original demand curve, right? Does that make sense? Okay. So just keep that in mind. Okay, back to where we were. There is one other technical note to make here before we move on. Technically speaking, we should have shifted the demand curves inward to account for the income effect of an insurance premium, right? So premiums are the amount that you pay every month so that you will be insured, right? So maybe $300 or $400 a month. So technically, the curve with insurance would be shifted in a bit because with insurance, you have insurance premiums. And if you're paying insurance premiums, that means that you have less money to spend overall after you pay those premiums. So your income has effectively been reduced once you have insurance coverage and are paying the premiums. Um, so if the premium was R dollars per year, then the consumer's income is effectively reduced by that amount, right? So additionally, we would have to shift in that new demand curve. So I guess technically it wouldn't have the same intercept after that adjustment. But we can, for the most part, we can ignore that because the effect is usually pretty small. So, but do be aware of it, okay? But for the most part, we can ignore it because it is small. I will say if you are rusty on elasticity, you may want to check out box 4.1. So it's the gray boxes that we seem to have in every chapter. This one goes over the elasticity of demand curves. So if you want to refresh your memory on how elasticity works, you might want to take a look at that. It also goes over income elasticity in addition to price elasticity. So that might be worthwhile to you guys. Um, so yeah, but everybody, do you all understand generally the idea of elasticity? It's a responsiveness to price changes, right? So you can sometimes it's helpful to think of it in terms of flexibility, right? How flexible are you? If you're very flexible, then you will have a large response to a price change because maybe you have other options, so you don't need that thing. If it gets more expensive, you can go get something else, or if it's something you really need, you can't be flexible. Then a large price change is not going to have a very large effect on how much you consume, right? Okay. All right, so let's cover this last one, the indemnity insurance. So this is probably the least common form of copayment. And again, this one is basically a flat payment for each medical service consumed. So maybe the flat payment is P star. Now, the nice thing about this one is it's relatively straightforward to analyze with our demand curve. It's basically, it causes a shift up by the amount P star, whatever the amount of the indemnity payment, right? It's just a shift up, reflecting the fact that consumers are basically getting a subsidy essentially. So their willingness to pay is higher by the amount P star. Okay, so we can see this in figure 4.10. So pretty straightforward, right? So this is the curve, the demand curve without indemnity payments. And then this is the new demand curve with indemnity payments. The amount of the payment is P star. And so, if the consumer is looking at a particular service with a price P, then without the payment, they would consume M1, and with the payment, they would consume M2, right? A higher amount. So this one's pretty straightforward, but like I said, they're not very common. But in any case, regardless of which type of copayment, we saw that in all cases, they lead to an increase in consumption of medical care, right? It doesn't matter what kind, they all increase the consumption of medical care. They just operate slightly differently, right? Okay. Any questions about copayments before we move on to deductibles? Okay, cool. So deductibles are very common. In fact, I mean, I guess there are some plans that have no deductible, but they're typically more expensive in terms of the premium. So most people choose to go with some kind of deductible. And in case you're not aware of what a deductible is, It's basically an amount of money that has to be paid by the consumer towards their medical bills before insurance payments start to kick in. And the main point of that is to make small losses uninsured, right? So if you just get sick and go to the doctor for some antibiotics, um, that visit probably wouldn't cover your deductible, which means you would pay fully out of pocket for that trip, right? For that visit. But let's say you break your leg and maybe your deductible is $500, and when you break your leg the treatment is $1,000. Well, basically you would have to pay the first $500 out of pocket, and then the remaining $500 is going to be at least partially covered by insurance, if not entirely. And it depends on your co-payments, right? So you'd have to pay the first $500 entirely out of pocket, and then you might have a co-insurance rate of 20% after that. So then you'd have to pay 20% of the remaining $500, right? And again, the idea here is to sort of make consumers pay for very small illnesses or small medical issues, um, and then insurance only kicks in for sort of bigger ones. Um, so just to talk about this a little bit more, I'll talk about what I typically buy in terms of health insurance with deductibles. And because I'm relatively young, obviously not as young as you whippersnappers, but um, uh, I'm still relatively young. I'm not having any sort of medical issues due to old age yet, so I typically get a pretty high deductible, right? Because I don't go to the doctor a lot, so I trade off a high deductible for lower premiums, right? So that my monthly payment is lower. Um, but that does mean that if I were to get into a bad accident or have some sort of really serious illness, I would have to pay a pretty large amount of money out of pocket before insurance even kicks in. So, there's a trade-off there. But I feel pretty good about it. Hopefully, nothing bad happens. Um, Now, while the concept of a deductible is relatively straightforward, its effects on demand are pretty complicated. And you'll see what I mean in just a second here. So we're going to look at some demand curves, and how a deductible might work. Okay. So the first thing to note here is that D, the deductible, is we can define it as M star. So if there's some amount of Medicare consumption that beyond that is the point at which insurance kicks in. Levels, um, the cost is fully out of pocket, right? So here you see M star. So at MA and M1, those amounts of care would have to be paid for out of pocket entirely by the consumer. But once we get past M star, that's when insurance kicks in, and so the effective price drops. So here we're basically assuming that M star is where the insurance kicks in, and that beyond that there is a 20% co-insurance rate. Okay, so this line here is basically 0.2 times P. Okay, so 20% of P. And then we have three different demand curves, which are representing different severities of illness. So D1 is the demand for like a common cold, is the demand for medical care for like a common cold or something very mild. And then D2 is a more severe illness, and then D3 is a very, very severe illness. So let's start with the mild illness, D1. So with D1, the consumer pays full price and consumes M1 in terms of the quantity of medical care. And they don't cover their deductible, right? It's not enough to cover their deductible, which means they pay it full out of pocket. Insurance never kicks in, and that's the result. So no insurance there with the small illness or the mild illness. But if we instead look at the very, very severe illness with D3, we see that at that point, the deductible has been fully paid because we've surpassed M star, and so insurance kicks in, and because insurance kicks in, the consumer ultimately consumes M3. Now, the complicated one is the sort of moderate illness, D2. And so the consumer really has kind of an interesting choice here, because we can see that they might consume MA at the full price P, right? Insurance never kicks in. They don't reach a point where they cover their deductible. So insurance never kicks in, and so they consume MA. They might try to increase their consumption to M star and perhaps beyond so that they cover their deductible and get some insurance money, right? At which point they might push beyond M star to consume MC at this lower insured price, right? Now, whether or not they do that is going to depend on these areas here, A and B, okay? Because basically, let's suppose that the consumer goes from consuming MA to consuming M star. Well, yeah, they covered their deductible, but they're ultimately not getting any insurance payments because they don't continue beyond M star. And if they did that, that wouldn't be rational because they'd basically lose surplus in the amount of this area A, right? So they would lose surplus if they did that. So that wouldn't make sense to do that rationally, right? But if they continued past M star to MC, they would then gain in surplus this area B here. So whether or not they continue from MA to MC is going to depend on whether B is bigger than A. If A is bigger, then they won't consume to MC. But if B is bigger than A, then they will consume MC. So there's kind of like a threshold effect going on, basically, where if the consumer is getting pushed right up against the deductible threshold, they start to have sort of an interesting interaction of choices going on. So I don't know. I don't know how you guys feel about this. This isn't that complicated, but it is kind of an interesting. It does produce a sort of interesting complication as far as deductibles go. All right, are there any questions about this? Looking good? No questions? Okay. Now there is one other complication that we didn't really think about that we pretty much ignored in this case, right? Because in this scenario here in this graph, this is a single illness. But in the real world, deductibles add up over time when you have, several visits to a doctor or several illnesses. So that's kind of one further complication, is the fact that a deductible doesn't apply to a single illness or a single doctor visit. It applies to it accumulates over the course of a year typically. So that's kind of interesting. Your book has an interesting example where it talks about a Valentine's Day date. I'm not really sure what the Valentine's Day date has to do with it, but it was something like you go on a date for Valentine's Day and you get food poisoning or something like that. So a relatively mild illness, right? And so you go to the doctor and you pay $75 out of pocket for the visit because you haven't reached your deductible yet. And then I think the example is like the deductible is $200, right? So you have that initial visit on Valentine's Day, which of course is early. That's probably why it's Valentine's Day, is because it's early in the year, right? So it's early in the year. You pay $75 to go to the doctor. You haven't hit your deductible yet, but since you've spent $75, you're basically that much closer to hitting your deductible, right? So now this person only has to spend an extra $125 to hit their $200 deductible, which means that the $75 that they spent not only got them the doctor's visit, but it also got them closer to their deductible, right? So in other words, um, there's a lower additional deductible. Um, and so if there was a severe illness, if this person did have a severe illness where they got past their deductible, they're now that much closer to hitting that threshold, right? Which means that they're that much closer to getting medical care that is at least partially insured, right? Um, but overall, right, the biggest takeaway about deductibles is that for small illnesses, demand looks like an consumer, whereas for larger illnesses, demand like the demand for an insured consumer, right? So that's the effect there, or the main takeaway. All right, one other issue. I'm going to stop sharing my video for a minute. Looks like my internet is unstable. All right, so the last issue regarding insurance is these maximum payment limits, right? Caps on the amount that the insurance company will pay out. There are, some plans have caps on totals. Not all. You can get plans that don't have caps, but they're more expensive, obviously. So typically might be something like 100,000 per year or 300,000 per lifetime, something like that. Um, and essentially, this has the opposite effect of deductibles. It makes very expensive medical events uninsured, right? So once you pass that threshold, you are no longer insured because you've passed the cap that the insurance company is willing to pay. Um, but there are some interesting innovations. Something called a stop loss feature that places upper limits on out-of-pocket spending. So rather than like a fixed cap on the insurance, your insurance company might guarantee a maximum loss that you would face. So it's kind of the same principle, but it works a little bit differently. But you don't need to know any other details about it other than that that's kind of a newer feature of some insurances, this stop loss feature. Basically guaranteeing you that you will lose no more than X amount, right? As a consumer. Now, in reality, most insurance plans are like some combination of these things, right? Almost all of them have deductibles, and then there's some sort of combination of co-payments or co-insurance. It just kind of depends on the plan and what the patient or the consumer wants, right? So, in particular, some combine indemnity and co-insurance rates. And a good important example of that would be Medicare Part B. So Medicare Part B, which we will talk about in more detail, I think in chapter 10 or 11, is an example of this. And so basically, the insurance company pays flat fees for per visit or per treatment, and then there's also some element of co-insurance going on. All right. Any questions so far? Okay, cool. Um, so that's kind of all the details on like the different aspects of insurance. But there are some other things that we want to think about that impact the demand for medical care. And one of those is time and travel costs. So we should recognize that time and travel costs are important costs, right? They're basically non-price costs of care. Um, and in a lot of ways, calculation can be complicated, and that's mainly because of the different ways that people might value time, right? So you can think of the different ways that an hourly employee with no sick leave values time compared to, say, a salaried employee that has sick leave, right? They're going to have different values of their time. And of course, we can even think about people that aren't necessarily working, right? Um, I'm sorry, I just got distracted because my brand new dog is having a very touching moment with my cat. Good job, Sophie. That was awesome. They're getting used to each other. Um, sorry. All right. So even for people that don't work, there's still a cost of time, right? There's still a value to people's time, even if they're not working. Um, and so the main point about that is that, like, if someone chooses to not work, they're basically foregoing what they could make in the labor market. And so if they choose not to work, they kind of reveal to a certain extent the value of their time. Um, they reveal to us that their time is at least at a minimum worth what they could earn in the market, because that's what they're giving up. Um, uh, Touching moment is turning into mayhem. Uh, my girlfriend's trying to corral them. Hey, Sophie, it's okay. Oh my God, my camera's off, so you guys have no idea what's going on. All right. The joys of working at home. All right. Anyway, so the important thing to recognize here is that time costs essentially act in the same way that money costs do, right? So if the cost of someone's time goes up, then the demand for their medical care will fall. As one example. Another example might be that if you have better sick leave, that would reduce the cost of your time, and that would lead to more medical care use, right? So nothing too cryptic here. We just have to recognize that time is money, right? The age old adage, time is money, applies in all things, right? Um, so in this sense, this is kind of like what we might consider to be a pure waiting cost, or a pure time cost. But there's other costs to time as well, and you might think of that in terms of waiting for treatment. And this is particularly important in places like Canada and other countries that have socialized medicine, and you hear about wait lists all the time. So that's what we're talking about here, is basically like wait lists. And it's a little bit, it's fundamentally different from basically what we just talked about, which you can kind of think of as more of like a pure cost. And the main thing here is that the main reason for the difference is that when people are on a wait list, they're not stuck waiting at a doctor's office, right? They're able to go out and do other things with their time, right? Their time is available for other things. So they're not giving up their time in that sense. But what is really, where the cost is coming from, is the fact that they're having to wait for treatment, right? And you can imagine that this would be really important for people with severe ailments, heart disease. They need a heart transplant, or coronary bypass. And if they have to wait for that, that could really mean bad things for their life. They could potentially die because they're waiting, right? And that would be like an extreme case. But that's kind of what we're talking about here, is it's not that people have to give up their time and can't be working or can't be at home doing things, home production. It's that the fact that they're waiting puts them at risk of being more ill or potentially dying. Okay. So this is a little bit different, but it's related, right? It's still the cost of time, in a way. Um, this isn't as direct, right? This is kind of more indirect, I guess. Let's see. I want to make sure I'm not missing anything here. Um, oh yeah. So now there is something interesting that goes on as a result of this type of cost of waiting, and that's that people might find care elsewhere. So this happens sometimes with Canadians. They will cross over the border into the United States to get some sort of treatment so that they don't have to wait. Now, of course, they have to pay for that out of pocket. It's not covered by Canadian health insurance, so But if you're on your if you're on the verge of dying, you might be willing to pay that, right? So that kind of cost can lead to some interesting choices in terms of like basically going abroad to get the care that you want, so that you don't have to wait. Um, and so, in addition to, well, are there any questions about the time aspects? Okay. So in addition to these time issues, right, related to waiting for care, there's also the issue of quality, right? So we've basically been ignoring quality this whole time. We've been basically assuming that quality is held constant, right? Ceteris paribus. But of course, there's different levels of quality in medical care, and there's two main facets or factors or ways that quality can differ. And I think the first one is maybe the more, I don't want to say obvious, but maybe the first one that comes to mind, and that's like, how good is the doctor? Like, is he really going to help? He or she really going to help me get better? Like, how good is this doctor at converting care into good health, right? So that's one facet of quality. But then, of course, there's other facets, and that's perhaps amenities associated with medical care, right? So I don't know if you've gone to a doctor's office, and some doctors have televisions in the waiting room, very comfortable chairs, lots of reading material. It's in a nice building, right? These types of qualities that aren't so much related to the medical care, but just like the amenities, the things associated with getting the care. How comfortable do I feel in the waiting room? How comfortable do I feel sitting in the doctor's office? Um, what is even things like, what is the doctor's bedside manner like, right? Are they very like, good about medical issues to me and making me feel safe and comfortable, or are they like, yeah, cancer, 6 months, 6 months to live, right? Like terrible bedside manner. You could think of that kind of like as an amendment, not really related to the medical care, right? But sort of ancillary. Um, and a good way to think about quality is kind of relating it to willingness to pay, right? Um, and and when we talk about demand and willingness to pay, we have to be specific not only about the treatment and the disease, but also the quality, and specifying the quality along both facets, right? Both the quality of how the care is transformed into medical outcomes, as well as any amenities that might be associated with a particular doctor or a hospital or a treatment even. And so really what we're talking about is, higher quality leads to higher willingness to pay or higher demand, right? So here we have three different demand curves with each with different qualities. So of course we must be assuming that everything else is held constant. So the illness is the same, the treatment is the same. It's just the quality of the treatment or the doctor or whatever is getting higher, and therefore the demand would be increasing for higher levels of quality. So that's really a very intuitive way to think about this, is just in terms of willingness to pay, right? So if the quality is better, then people typically have a higher willingness to pay, which translates into a higher demand, right? Now, one issue here is that quality is very subjective for the most part, but it does have a very real and measurable meaning. Um, and that's really why it can be useful in analyzing it, or rather it can be useful in analyzing co-payments, where specialists provide a higher quality of care. So this is kind of going back to what we talked about earlier with the copay situation, the flat copay. um, if you believe, or you think that specialists provide a higher level of quality of care, and you have a copayment, a flat copayment, well then yeah, it's a no-brainer. Go to the specialist rather than going to the primary care physician. because they're going to give you a better level of quality in terms of care. So, um, but again, just thinking of it in terms of willingness to pay is probably the best way to think about it. Now, as far as measuring these things, there have been a few approaches, and most of them are related to things that we've already seen. Okay, so mortality rates, right? Um, if I go to translated, if I go to this doctor, what are my odds of survival, right? Or if I go to this hospital, what are my odds of survival? So there was a study, I think, what was it, in the 70s? Let's see here. In the 90s, sorry, in the 90s, the New York State Department of Health started publishing mortality rates for doctors and hospitals doing open heart surgery. So very, very specific treatment. Um, but oh man, can you imagine? Can you imagine being a doctor and then all of a sudden the New York Department of Health is publishing your mortality rates as a doctor? So you can imagine that like a lot of doctors were initially kind of upset with this, but it ultimately ended up being a really good thing because um, uh, people started going to better doctors and better hospitals, according to this data. And that in turn should provide an incentive for doctors that aren't that good to improve their quality, right? So it actually turned out to be a really good thing. But there were some issues early on. And one of those issues was selection bias. So basically, the sickest patients were self selecting the best hospitals. And so, even though they were the best hospitals, um, because they were admitting the sickest patients, their mortality rates were kind of high. Um, and so, just looking at mortality rates, it would seem as though those hospitals weren't that good, but they only appeared to not be that good because they were taking in the sickest patients, right? So, so then they later on started making adjustments for this selection bias. Um, and once the selection bias was adjusted for, patients started shifting towards better hospitals and better doctors, and they were also willing to pay higher prices for the better doctors and better hospitals. So ultimately, it was something that improved efficiency uh, for the most part. All right, and then one last issue to talk about is patient beliefs and the informed or perhaps uninformed consumer. So, in particular, what we're thinking about here is the fact that different families hold particular views on the effectiveness or efficacy of medical care. And just to think of some extreme examples, there are some religious backgrounds that um, they don't believe in medical care in modern medicine. So in particular, there was a family I think that I heard about in Idaho. They basically didn't go to the doctor ever because it was against their religious beliefs. They believed that God knew what was best for them and would take care of them, and they didn't need medicine, right? So obviously, their demand for medical care would be very low. And then there are, more normal people that have a very high belief in medical care. So we can kind of think of this in terms of trust, right? So a higher degree of trust would imply a higher willingness to pay. Um, and so I guess that's kind of more a general belief about medicine, but there can also be beliefs about specific therapies or treatments. Um, and who knows how people form their beliefs? That's an empirical question, but um, you know, people have different beliefs about different treatments, and so, but again, you can just think about it in terms of trust, right? If a patient trusts in a medical procedure more so than some other medical procedure, they're going to have a higher willingness to pay for that treatment. But this does kind of bring up one last final issue, and that's the fact that most of the information that a consumer or patient is receiving about a treatment or something like that is coming from the provider, the doctor that is going to be performing the treatment. And so this leads us to sort of the, if you guys remember, the car mechanic situation that we talked about early on, right? The fact that there is a vast degree of asymmetric information or asymmetric knowledge, really, right? The asymmetric knowledge issue. And so if you've got a doctor saying, oh, this is what's wrong with you and this is what you need, that basically sets up a scenario where the doctor could potentially induce demand, right? Say, oh, it's like the mechanic saying, oh yeah, we need to refill your blinker fluid. Yeah, which isn't a thing. And we need to do all this work on your car and it's going to cost a lot of money, but you need it, right? Which isn't really good. But fortunately, we have like the Hippocratic Oath and those sorts of things. So hopefully, although there is this opportunity for doctors to take advantage of patients, hopefully it's minimal. But again, that's an empirical question that we would have to answer, looking at data and doing some sort of statistical analysis. So, oh, one other issue. Sorry, this is the last one. So all this discussion of quality kind of leads us to sort of a need to revisit the price index for healthcare. So we talked about the price index earlier. So really, what we would like, now that we've thought about quality, is having a quality adjusted price index. And some studies have attempted this. And the studies that have attempted this quality adjustment have actually come to the conclusion that after adjusting for quality, it turns out that medical care costs are falling. They aren't rising. And one particular economist had a really sort of simple way of thinking about this. He asked, would you rather have healthcare from 1950s or today? The answer is today, please. They had good medical care in the 50s, but it's way better today. So I'd much rather have medical care from the modern era rather than say 50 or 60 years ago. So. All right. So to summarize, basically the first half of this chapter is just us deriving demand from, basic consumer theory using utility function, indifference curves, and budget constraints. And of course, we got the usual result that demand is downward sloping. And we thought about the impacts of various aspects of health, including particular illnesses or severity of illness. And then we looked at how insurance and its several features can impact demand. And then we wrapped up talking and thinking about how quality can have impacts on demand, both through, sort of direct quality measurements, but also in terms of people's beliefs, right? Just what they believe about the quality of healthcare. And in our discussion of insurance, we came to a pretty straightforward conclusion that it generally acts to reduce the price of care. And when the price goes down, we know that because of the law of demand, quantity goes up, quantity demand goes up, right? So its use increases. So that's the chapter, heavily theory-based. So in the next chapter, we will look at the evidence, right? So look at the empirical data, the evidence that exists to support this theory. And we'll see that, there might be some issues, but for the most part, the evidence pretty strongly supports the theory. So, which is, that's how science works, right? The reason we just learned all that theory is because the data supports it, right? But we'll take a look at the data in the next chapter. But this is the end of chapter 4, and it is the end of the material that is on your first exam. So be aware of that. And let's see, I need to go ahead and assign you some homework problems here. So let me give you those. Okay, so let's do problem number 1 from this chapter. How about number 5? And number 8. All right, so that'll be your homework for this chapter. Your last homework is due tomorrow, I believe. And on Wednesday we will start chapter 5, and we'll start getting to that. So, but yeah, so work on this new homework. Start studying for your first exam. And again, remember that the exam problems are basically going to be very, very similar to the homework problems. Wink, wink. So in other words, it's either going to be stuff that you've already done on a homework, or one of these questions at the end of the book that maybe we didn't do, right? So that's probably a good thing to do, is just go over the problems at the end of these chapters, particularly the ones that weren't assigned for homeworks. Okay, are there any questions about anything? Yes.
Can you repeat the questions we have to do and when they're due?
Yes, 1, 5, and 8. And I didn't even give you a date that they were due, so thanks for bringing that up. We'll have those due, let's just make those due next Tuesday as well. All right, any other questions? No?
I don't think we can upload our file to the homework too.
Oh, I haven't set up a link for that. Okay, well, I'll do
Yeah.
that right after class. I'll get a submission link for your homework number 2 put up
Okay,
right after
great.
class here. Thank you for telling me that. Anything else? Okay. Well, if there's no other questions, you guys have a good day, and I'll see you on Wednesday. Bye.